Let's begin. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is h5. King to e7. h6. g6, check. King to e5. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook, check. Knight takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes rook, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The answer is knight takes pawn, check. King to h1. Queen takes rook, check. King to h2. Queen takes knight. King takes knight. h5. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen to e8. Queen to h8, check. King to e7. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. a5. Queen to b7. Queen to a4. Bishop to d7. a6. Queen to b5. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Rook to b3. Next, the threats are rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes rook. f4. Rook to f7, check. King to e5. King to e7. King to e4. King to f6. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is d3. Knight to d6, check. King to f3. Knight to b5. King to f2. h4. g4. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are bishop takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to g4. Rook to c7. Knight takes pawn. Queen to g5. Knight to h4, check. King to h8. Queen to e6. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to h1, check. Queen to d3, check. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to f8. Queen to e4. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook. d3. Another one. The threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using e4. Pawn takes pawn. King to a5. King to f3. King to b4. f6. Pawn takes pawn. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are pawn takes pawn, check. Knight to a2, check. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Knight to c6, check. King to e3. Pawn takes pawn. Another one. The threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using e4. King takes pawn. King to h4. King to d5. King takes pawn. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes rook. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is pawn takes rook. Rook takes pawn. f5. Knight to c4. f4. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook takes bishop, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to d1. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Rook to c1. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Rook to c1, check. King to h2. Another puzzle. The threats are queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook to c8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to e3. King to d7. d6. Queen to b8. Rook to c7, check. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes queen. Let's continue. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h4. f4. King to e4. King to g6. King to e5. f3. g3. Let's continue. Here are the threats. King takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. c4, check. Answer to this puzzle is king takes pawn. King to c4. King to g5. e5. King to g6. King takes pawn. King to f7. King to d6. King to e8. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is pawn takes pawn. c2. King to d2. Promotes to rook. King takes rook. King to b4. King to c2. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Bishop to a2, check. Queen to c1, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to b8, check. King to a1. Queen to e7. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are queen to f4, check. Queen to f2, check. Rook to f1, check. Rook to f1, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to f1, check. King to e8. Queen to h7. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using queen takes pawn, check. King to b8. Knight to c6, check. Pawn takes knight. Rook to b1, check. King to a7. Rook takes pawn. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen to a3, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to a3, check. King to b1. Knight to d5. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is g5. King to d5. g6. King to e6. King to g5. c4. King to h6. Another one. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is king to d4. g5. g3. g4. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. b4. Let's continue. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are knight to e7, check. Knight to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to e7, check. King to g7. Queen to e5, check. Rook to f6. Knight to d5. Rook to f8. Rook to e4. Queen takes pawn. Rook to f4. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. Another puzzle. The threats are there are no threats in this position. The checks are rook to e8, check. Rook to a6, check. The best move in puzzle position is a4, d6, a3, d7, b2. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.